And so we're making our way through Beowulf here. Beowulf has just offered to Hrothgar to cleanse uh, Heorot, um, almost as though he was going to do an exorcism on it, chase the demons out. I've also heard men say, as Beowulf is speaking, I've also heard men say this monster is so reckless he spurns the use of weapons. Therefore, so that Huyalak my lord may rest content over my conduct, I deny myself the use of a sword and a broad yellow shield in battle. But I shall grapple with this fiend hand to hand. We shall fight for our lives, foe against foe, and he whom death takes off must resign himself to the judgment of God. Now, Tolkien, in his commentary, thinks that originally what happened here was that Beowulf, and he writes his own version of the Beowulf story, a short text called Selic Spell, which he has written that he thinks should represent the most primitive, earliest elements in the story. He leaves off the dragon fight, um, which is a little bit ironic considering the fact that he was one of the first men to stand up for the dragon fight in his famous lecture that he gave on the Beowulf, the Monsters, and the Critics in 1936, when he insisted that the dragon episode was not superfluous at all, but was essential for rounding out Beowulf's life. The first two-thirds of the narrative tell the deeds of a young man with his power rising, almost like the moon as it moves toward the full. And then the dragon episode tells the tale of the rash deeds of an old man. 50 years later, he's 70. He must be in his 70s at the time of the dragon fight, whose fortunes are on the wane, and he is ruled at that point as a king for 50 winters. So he might be in his 70s before he has a reversal of fortune, and the dragon comes to visit him. Same thing too with Hrothgar, who claims that he has ruled for 50 winters before Grendel showed up. So again, there's the mirroring effect that the poet likes to have. He also has Grendel's mother having inhabited her abode for 50 years as well, as though she's a sort of mimic of Hrothgar's reign and Beowulf's reign. Um, but in his commentary, he thinks that originally what happened was that there weren't 14 men plus Beowulf, but that originally Beowulf was part of a group of 3 men, himself and two characters, one that he names Ashwood, who has a kind of magical ashwood spear, and the character Honshu, who's an actual character in the text. I think he's the one that Grendel carries off, the only one of the 15 that he carries off, who has a kind of magical glove in Tolkien's narrative. And that it would have been the case that these 3 men would have gone in good fairy tale fashion, and the first 2 would have struck out, and he has them both being killed and eaten by Grendel, and then the third try would have been the success. Primarily, this is the fairy tale motif of the young, underestimated brother or sister, and Cinderella, it's the youngest sister who's totally underestimated by the older sisters, or in some of the other fairy tales, it's this youngest child or the youngest brother who succeeds where the older brothers fail. They cannot perform the task. There's also the task, the magical task that's performed, let's say, by Arthur. He's the only one who has the power to draw the sword from the stone because he's the legitimate one for the deed. It's that motif again, too. Beowulf is the only one who can perform this task that everyone else has failed at simply because he's up to the task. He's the man for the job. And so it may or may not have been the case. Tolkien does say that whatever the situation, it would explain Beowulf's passivity when Grendel attacks, and he attacks Honshu and gobbles him up, and there's a strange passivity at that point on Beowulf's part. He does nothing. He simply listens and watches. That might be an atavistic holdover, according to Tolkien, of this threefold challenge against the monster. So Beowulf goes on here. He says, I know that Grendel, should he overcome me, will without dread devour many Geats, matchless warriors in the battle hall, as he has often devoured Danes before. If death claims me, you will not have to cover my head, for he already will have done so, with a sheet of shining blood. He will carry off the blood-stained corpse, meaning to savor it. The solitary one will eat without sorrow and stain his lair. No longer then will you have to worry about burying my body, because there won't be a body to bury. There'll just be a head left. As one of the characters, I think it may be Ashera later on, who is gobbled up and just a head is left of him. But if battle should claim me, send this most excellent coat of mail to Huyalak, this best of corselets that protects my breast. It once belonged to Hrethel, the work of Wieland, and Wieland the smith is the primary, the equivalent, the Scandinavian equivalent to Greek Vulcan. He's the only god of the Scandinavian pantheon who is actually mentioned in the text by name. Fate goes ever as it must, and of course fate here is weird, W-Y-R-D. It later becomes W-E-I-R-D. The word weird comes from this, as in the case of the Weird Sisters in Macbeth. And there are three sisters for a reason. Originally we had three Norns, who are like the three fates in Greek myth, and they are the ones who govern fate. Oswald Spengler points out in The Decline of the West that each civilization has a completely different destiny idea, and they don't map on. The destiny idea of the Greeks, Moira, was of an impersonal fate embedded in the cosmos to which even Zeus is subordinate. Even Zeus has to be subordinate to Moira. Whereas, let's say with the Islamic, let's say with the Levantine religions, the Judeo-Christian Islamic religions, fate is best personified there as Kismet, where fate comes directly from God and exclusively from God. And as Islam means, one must submit. So too in the book of Job, Job's only solution to the task that the paces that God puts him through is simply to submit. Fate comes from one single being in that tradition. In the Northern European West, the Scandinavian idea of weird, though it sounds similar to Moira as this impersonal cosmic web, it actually ends up becoming the case as the centuries evolve that weird, fate becomes something that comes out of the individual. And it's part of the mythology, as Joseph Campbell used to like to point out, the mythology in the Northern European West of the unique individual. This becomes in Jung, the individuation process, Menschwerdung, and the word weird is buried in there with Werdung, werden, to become in German. And so this destiny idea is from a previous sign regime, the Scandinavian sign regime, that has now been overcoated by the Christian sign regime, where fate has been rewired and reassigned to a single being. But it's wrong. It's what Spengler called a pseudomorphosis, where you get an alien sign regime overcoating a native sign regime, and the two don't match up. Fate does not come from God in the Northern European Western tradition. It unfolds organically out of the life of the individual. That's what our pantheon of great heroes is about, from Beowulf all the way down to, let's say, Michael Corleone in the Godfather films. Each individual as a species, as a metaphysical destiny idea unto himself in the Northern West. Hrothgar, protector of the Scyldings, replied, "Beowulf, my friend, so you have come here because of past favors to fight on our behalf. Your father Ecgtheow, by striking a blow, began the greatest of feuds. He slew Hithelaf of the Wolfings with his own hand. After that, the Geats dared not harbor him for fear of war. So he sailed here." And apparently Beowulf's father, Ecgtheow, was a refugee after he slew Hithelaf of the Wolfings. The Geats would not welcome him back. He had no place to go. So apparently he took his son with him, maybe the son was 5 or 6 or 7 years old, across the water to Hrothgar's court. And so this is why Beowulf has returned to pay back the debt of refuge and the weregild, the blood money that the father paid, or that Hrothgar rather paid on behalf of his father to the Wolfings. So he sailed here over the rolling waves to this land of the South Danes. Now they're South Danes. Before they were West Danes, then East Danes, now they're South Danes. The honored Scyldings. I was young then, had just begun to reign over the Danes in this glorious kingdom, this treasure stronghold of heroes. That's a kind of appellation that you hear often described of Valhalla as a treasure stronghold of heroes. My elder brother Harogar, Halfdane's son, had died not long before. We don't know how, but perhaps Harogar was slain by the Heathobards. He was a better man than I. I settled your father's feud by payment. I sent ancient treasures to the Wolfings over the water's back, and Ecgtheow swore oaths to me. So if a Thane swears an oath to an overlord, then the overlord has the right to call on him to perform a favor for him. Apparently Ecgtheow died before that ever happened, and the favor now devolves upon the son. So Beowulf has come to do a favor and rid them, which is a politically sagacious move on Beowulf's part, of course, to take the opportunity of creating an alliance with the Danes by getting rid of this monster that is terrorizing them. And it's interesting that Beowulf's parents are apparently dead. No word is said about them other than we don't know his mother's name. We know her family. The family, she's the sister of Huyalak, so we know her family. The genealogy is traced matristically through the mother. Note that. That seems to be an atavism, an archaic survival of a matristic tendency that may have been present in early Scandinavian society, perhaps. I just find it interesting that we don't know anything about the father, Ecgtheow's ancestry. His name is also very different, as is Beowulf's name. Tolkien hypothesizes that actually Ecgtheow probably was the last of the kings of the Geats. Beowulf is purely fictional, and it's interesting that he just sort of has no parents. The parents are never referred to. When they go back to Geatland, the mother doesn't show up for any of the get-togethers, so we assume that she's dead. And Beowulf has no offspring. That's an interesting thing, too. For a man of such virility and power, and we know that he does marry a queen, he produces no offspring. That's an interesting telling detail about him, that he represents the end of a line. Unlike Sheffing, who came mysteriously from across the waters, like Beowulf, to provide a shield, again like Beowulf, for the Danes, and founds a whole dynasty, albeit a doomed dynasty. But Beowulf founds no dynasty at all. He's simply the end of an entire tradition and way of life, the end of the Völkerwanderung, the age of migrations that wraps up the Dark Ages as they meld into the Middle Ages. The Epic Age will give way to the Chivalric Age, and the Arthurian romances in the 12th century is the sequel to the great epics that are written about Beowulf and the Eddas and the Song of Roland. The age of the great epic heroes is about, from 700 to 1100, let's say. Then the age of chivalry and the courtly romances comes in, and those cycle out by 1300. They're done doing what they're going to do by 1300, and then in comes the age of the Icelandic sagas, where we get a ton of Icelandic sagas that are written between 13 and 1400. And then after that, of course, we get the novels, starting with Don Quixote in 1600, which begins to announce the death knell of the epic and the age of the great hero, which then dies down quietly. And Milton's Paradise Lost, for all intents and purposes, is really the last great epic. It fills me with anguish to admit to all the evil that Grendel, goaded on by his hatred, has wreaked in Heorot with his sudden attacks and infliction of injuries. My hall troop is depleted, my band of warriors. Fate has swept them into Grendel's ghastly clutches. Yet God can easily prevent this reckless ravager from committing such crimes. After quaffing beer, brave warriors of mine have often boasted over the ale cup that they would wait in Heorot and fight against Grendel with their fearsome swords. Then the next morning when day dawned, men could see that this great mead hall was stained by blood, that the floor by the benches was spattered with gore. I had fewer followers, dear warriors, for death had taken them off. But first, sit down at our feast, and in due course, as your inclination takes you, tell how warriors have achieved greatness. There's a note of condescension there in Hrothgar's telling Beowulf to just have a seat, and he doesn't think, obviously, that Beowulf is going to have any more success against Grendel than any of his men have had. Why should he? Then in the feasting hall, a bench was cleared for the Geats altogether, and there those brave men went and sat, delighting in their strength. A thane did his duty, held between his hands the adorned ale cup, poured out gleaming liquor. Now and then the poet raised his voice, resonant in Heorot. Here is the first reference, I think it's the first, to a shop singing songs, but the poet doesn't tell us what songs he's singing until after Beowulf is victorious against Grendel. Then we start hearing what the content of the songs are, the tale of Zeamund and the story of Heremod, and then the Finnsburg raid. No small company of Scyldings and Geats. Ecglaf's son Unferth, who sat at the feet of the Lord of the Scyldings, unlocked his thoughts with these unfriendly words. Unferth actually means unpeace, according to Tolkien. He's a personification of resentment and envy. He's the model for Grandma Wormtongue in The Two Towers. And he gives Beowulf a hard time here. Someone has to. For the journey of Beowulf, the brave seafarer, much displeased him in that he was unwilling for any man in this wide world to gain more glory than himself. And then we'll pause there for this one for Unferth's speech.